Before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to my teacher, the Most Venerable John May Park, and to you, Hei Kwang Sunim, and to your Sangha. I hope you're all doing well. Today's Dhamma talk is on the Eightfold Path. The path is divided into three stages: virtue, mental purification, and insight. Virtue consists of right speech, right discipline, and right livelihood. Mental purification consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the insight or wisdom aspect of the Eightfold Path is right view and right intention. Let's begin with right view. You know, it's wrong to say that it's best to have no views at all. A lot of people have that confused, and people think that having any view at all is wrong. Actually, the Buddha wants us to develop a precise view of the Four Noble Truths. And what's meant by that is a conviction in the law of karma and rebirth, which we're going to be covering in our next Dhamma talk, and a conviction that following this path is valid and will yield positive results. Now, views affect how we approach things. Let me give an example. I happen to like baseball, but let's assume that my view of baseball is that it's boring and kind of like watching paint dry. So let's suppose a friend invites me to a baseball game. If I have that view of baseball, that's probably going to skew my reaction to the game the whole afternoon and possibly skew my interactions with my friend, and maybe the day won't be as positive as if he had taken someone to the baseball game with him that happened to like baseball. Now that's a very simple example, but one that gives us a good example of how views can affect how we approach things. So if we approach the Eightfold Path with wrong view, then we're starting out on the wrong path already. Number 2 on the Eightfold Path is called right intention. The Buddha explains right intention as threefold: the intention of renunciation, the intention of goodwill, and the intention of harmlessness. Now, the intention of renunciation means the intention of letting go of things, like we talked about last week in terms of attachment and clinging and grasping in terms of the second noble truth. And then secondly, he's talking about an intention of goodwill or harmlessness, which means equanimity. I have a rule with myself that any interaction I have with other people should at worst be neutral. So that's an idea of intention of goodwill and harmlessness. Right speech, right discipline, and livelihood constitute the virtue stage of the path. Third on the Eightfold Path is right speech. Words are extremely important. I mean, words can start wars and get people killed. They can also heal divisions and bring peace and love. And what comes to mind here was probably one of the best trainings I received when I was in law enforcement, which is called verbal judo. And verbal judo is a skill that is de-escalating a situation where a person is upset or aggressive and possibly going to become verbally or worse, physically violent. And verbal judo allows us to de-escalate a situation simply by using verbal behavior. And I think the interesting thing about verbal judo, it's extremely effective and certainly a good example of right speech, because it saved me from a lot of situations where I might have gotten hurt or the other individual involved with me might have gotten hurt. And so I really appreciate the power of right speech. The other aspect of right speech is if you clean up your speech, your words actually become more meaningful and useful, and people take you more seriously. We all know people that are constantly jabbering and talking and that type of thing, and pretty soon they just sound like a radio or a television that's just going off in the background, and people don't really listen to them that much. So when they do have something important to say, many times it's lost because it's just lost in this constant babble, chit-chat that they're doing, and it's not really an effective type of speech. Now, the next aspect of right speech is do not speak falsehoods. That doesn't mean that you have to tell the truth. It means that you shouldn't lie. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, so let me elaborate on that a little bit. I'm not talking about avoiding malicious lies or conning people out of their money. I mean, that's wrong and that can be stopped. But how about that situation where you're in a job interview and they say, well, could you tell us a few of your negative aspects or some things we might be aware of here? Does one really want to go there in a job interview and be perfectly honest about negative aspects of oneself? Or how about the accident victim that's out on the pavement and you walk up to them and say, hey buddy, whoa, you don't stand a chance. Endeavor to tell the truth. But sometimes we have to understand that we need to be somewhat benevolent about this and somewhat compassionate. And if something doesn't need to be said, then don't say it, even if it is the truth. A lot of people have an impression, well, it's the truth and I need to say it. Well, you really don't sometimes need to say it. And so I think we need to understand that in terms of not speaking falsehoods. Be sure to be aware of out and out lies, because that is something we can deal with. But on the other hand, this idea that we always have to speak the truth may at times turn out a little bit cumbersome. So let's just be aware of that. Now, the fourth part of the Eightfold Path is called right discipline. And it may sound funny, but it's discipline that actually frees us. One of my favorite sayings is that the only freedom in life is the freedom to be self-disciplined. And in Buddhism, we're fortunate because we have what we call precepts. There are 311 precepts for nuns, 227 precepts for monks, but for you, there are only 5. And the 5 precepts are: abstain from killing, abstain from taking what is not offered, abstain from engaging in sexual misconduct, abstain from speaking falsehoods, and abstain from alcohol and intoxicants. Now, many of you know what the 5 precepts are, but I wanted to list them because I also want to talk about 2 things. One, notice that I did not say do not before each of the 5 precepts. Endeavor to abstain from, for example, endeavor to abstain from alcohol and intoxicants. Now notice, if you put it that way, implicit in that is that we need to develop a skill in terms of the precepts in a way that's most effective in our lives. The precepts are not commandments. What they are is guidelines as to ethical living. So let's remember, the 4 Noble Truths aren't commandments, and neither are the 5 precepts. The second thing I'd like to point out about the 5 precepts is the idea that Buddhism travels well. Notice that each of these precepts, for example, abstain from alcohol and intoxicants, abstain from sexual misconduct, abstain from taking what does not belong to you, those types of things are very general statements which apply to any culture under almost any circumstances. So, for example, in terms of sexual misconduct, even though the sexual mores and customs of a culture may differ from ours, the precept could be quite well applied to almost any culture at any time. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. One of the reasons that Buddhism spread so effectively is this ability to travel well. Number 5 on the Eightfold Path is called right livelihood. Now, any occupation will do as long as you acquire your wealth legally, peacefully, and honestly. Some examples of wrong livelihood are dealing in intoxicants, poison, slavery of humans, for example, also practicing deceit, soothsaying, and trickery, just to name a few. But in accordance with right livelihood, a point I'd like to make is that you can also earn riches. The Dhamma doesn't denigrate the state of being very wealthy. In fact, the Buddha's billionaire benefactor, a man by the name of Anathapindika, was one of the wealthiest supporters of the Buddha, and he became quite advanced on the path. So there's nothing wrong with being rich as long as your wealth was earned virtuously. Anyone can follow the path, no matter what their social economic status. Now, right livelihood also means that you're engaged with the world. And when you're engaged in the world, this trains you in mindfulness. Enlightenment is just as likely to come from sweeping a warehouse floor as it is meditating alone in the forest. The mental purification stage consists of the last 3 parts of the Eightfold Path. That is, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And as you remember from our last Dharma talk, these are the 3 key aspects to meditation. Let's start with right effort. Right effort actually is the key to the practice. Why? Because it's the will to cultivate the path. You know, my father used to say, you don't catch any fish sitting around the cabin. And I would have to say that you don't move along the path without right effort. At times we need to make a great amount of effort, because if we don't, things aren't going to change with us. Remember, It's our habitual patterns that drive our passions and emotions. So right effort is the key to a successful practice. Number 7 on the Eightfold Path is mindfulness. I'm reminded of a story in the Pali Canon where the Buddha had a monk come to him and tell him he was having great difficulty remembering everything. I mean, the precepts, remembering the different teachings, remembering this, remembering that. And the Buddha looked at him and said, "Can you just do one thing?" And the monk said, "Sure, what's that?" And the Buddha said, "Can you be mindful? Can you remember to be mindful?" And that shows you how critical mindfulness is in the practice. Now, also that kind of gives you an indication why He Kwang and I are always talking about mindfulness in terms of experiential Zen. Beyond the meditation cushion, mindfulness should be applied in our ordinary existence as a way of life, as a lifestyle of mindfulness. Now, something I'd like to mention here, just like learning to throw a baseball or learning to develop any other skill, developing the skill of mindfulness takes some time. And I've had people tell me, I get tired of trying to remember to be mindful all the time. Does that ever stop? As you develop the skill and you work on it more and more and more, what you'll find is you don't have to necessarily think about it and stop and go, "Oh, I need to be mindful, I need to be mindful." It just starts to happen as an activity just throughout the day with you without even having to make let's say, a special effort to remember to be mindful. And when that starts to happen, it's really beautiful. And I guarantee you it will, as long as you keep trying and as long as you keep practicing. And then pretty soon mindfulness becomes part of your day rather than necessarily something you have to remember to do. I'm reminded of a wonderful day that He Kwang and I spent at Deer Park Monastery, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery. It's about 35-40 minutes from Bo Kwang Temple here in San Diego. And while we were there, an interesting thing would happen. At random intervals throughout the day, you would hear this gong. And when the gong went off, everyone turned toward the sound, bowed slightly, and remembered to be mindful. And I can remember that, during the day we would be going here, going there, talking about this, talking about that, and all of a sudden the gong would go off, and I'd turn toward the sound, and I'd bow, and I'd remember to be mindful again. Very, very effective tool and a marvelous way to practice mindfulness. The final factor on the path is called right concentration. And the Pali word for right concentration is samadhi. When you think about it, at any given moment, the mind must be cognizant of something, a sight, a sound, smell, taste, touch, or a mental object. Concentration represents an intensification of one-pointedness of mind. That is zeroing in 100% and concentrating on what you're doing or on the object which you're dealing with or the situation in which you're dealing with. And concentration is the factor for ensuring that an active mind remains centered on that object or that activity. Now, samadhi is exclusively concentration in a wholesome state of mind. For example, a killer is going to pull the trigger, may have a high degree of concentration, but that would not be considered samadhi. Be well, my friends.